When I was told of the theme of this conference by Lou Frey, it reminded me of a story about the Middle East peace talks. Everybody knows that in the Middle East there are two potential ways to get a settlement. There's a miraculous way and there's a practical way. For instance, if you could get Muhammad, Moses, and Jesus to appear together, they all were in the same place, and they imposed a settlement, everyone would agree on it. Now, that's the practical way. Then there's a miraculous way, which would be for the leaders of that area of the world to come together and actually agree on a settlement. Lou getting all the ex-governors together to talk about governing Florida is not necessarily practical, but it does approach the miraculous. It was my pleasure to serve as Lawton Chiles Lieutenant Governor for 8 years. I don't think it should be overlooked, however, that I also served as Reuben Askew's lieutenant for 8 years, and I served as Bob Graham's lieutenant for 8 years. Anyone who's been in the legislature and understands what it's like to be a floor manager understands that you're not independent, you are a lieutenant. So I'm one of the longest serving lieutenants in Florida history. I'd like to talk a little bit today, not so much about the principles of governing Florida, but about the practicalities. And I'd like to start out talking just for a moment about the campaigns, because that's part of it. This is a different state to govern. It's a different state to campaign in. It's also a very fun place, and the campaigns always come up with funny war stories. Working with Lawton Chiles was very different. I see many people in the room today who worked with Lawton, and they understand exactly what I'm saying. You never knew what was going to happen. It was always funny, and there were usually surprise endings. Word had gotten out that we were thinking of running together. Lawton Chiles had been in retirement for 2 years. We had not announced, we had not really planned a campaign, we were not sure we were going to start running, and contributions started pouring in. Checks all the way from $1, $2, all the way up to Lawton's limit of $100. We had no headquarters, we had no mailbox, we had no campaign manager, and no phones. Our opponents immediately figured out that we had a problem. And so checks started coming in that were made payable to Fido Smith, or were from Fido Smith, and it said occupation dog. And there was one from Tweety Jones, occupation canary. There was one from Buster Brown, occupation kindergarten. We didn't have a campaign manager, we didn't have a campaign, so we got a volunteer committee, and they started posting these checks, making records, and putting them in the bank. The law required they be put in the bank within 24 hours. The press got a hold of this and was having a field day, so we had a committee meeting, and we decided we'd put together another committee, so we put together another volunteer committee to send back the illegal checks, and they developed a form letter that said, Dear Fido, thank you for your contribution, but we must send it back. It appears that you're a dog. Sincerely, Chiles-MacKay. P.S. If you're not a dog, please send the money back. And then we didn't have a campaign headquarters, so a Republican Chevrolet dealer in Tallahassee, Bill Thomas, who was upset with Governor Martinez about the services tax, gave us this almost new facility that he was moving out for an even bigger facility. ideal. So we moved in without asking any questions. And then it turned out he had not told us the exact whole story. There was this problem that his used car operation was still there. So we had a campaign going on in the same place where they were selling used Chevrolets. We didn't have any phones, so we were using the Bill Thomas Chevrolet phones, and they were ringing, and the people were saying, "Bill, answer line 6, Bill, answer line 6. Well, if we didn't have any volunteers named Bill, the phone would be answered Thomas Chevrolet. And the people would say, well, what is Thomas Chevrolet's position on thong bathing suits? And whoever it was would give a position. So we didn't have an organization, we didn't have a campaign, we didn't have any positions, and that's what was going on. I brought in a political editor who is in the room today and had him tour the operation with us, and he said, this is absolute sheer genius. You have thrown everybody off track. Now you've got to tell me where is the real headquarters. I want to raise this question. You might call this the revised standard version of the question of governing Florida. And this is a question that was raised by Florida Trend magazine one time in the middle of our first term, and that is Florida governable? I'm not talking about principles, I'm talking about practicalities. Florida is the improbable joinder of the south end of Appalachia with the north end of the 22nd century. Orlando's right at the dividing lines. Within 50 miles of here, there are counties that look exactly like Arkansas, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, Louisiana. No jobs, no growth, no earthly idea of what to do. And the growth policy for young people in that part of Florida is move out, go somewhere else. How many counties in Florida do you think there are with less than 50,000 population? Anybody care to guess? There's 67 counties total. Well, the answer, this may be changed a little because it's a couple of years out of date. The answer is 34 out of the 67. What percent of Florida's total population lives in those counties? 4%. So there is not one Florida, there are two Floridas. One of the hackneyed expressions was, in Florida, the further south you go, the further north you get. The further north you go, the further south you get. There are at least two cultures. There are two completely different political issues. I see Dale Maletta, who lobbies for small counties, and the small counties' problems in Florida are absolutely different. So, what is the growth policy of Florida? Well, it depends on where you look. Let me tell you what the constitutional growth policy is for the state of Florida. The constitutional policy is set up in our tax section of the Constitution. We don't have an income tax, we don't have an estate tax. And that's constitutional. Well, what kind of growth policy is that? I can tell you what it is. Throttle to the firewall. And then we have the most liberal bankruptcy laws, homestead exemption laws in America. So you say, well, we're going to try to manage growth in Florida. The thing you have to understand as students of political science is there are limits on what you can do in the state of Florida. So finally, Everett Dirksen was a great speaker, one of America's most famous speakers. Sometimes he spoke too long, and he'd get in the middle of a speech and he'd say, finally, and then he'd say, you know, I noticed that there are some words that people like better than others. He said they really like to hear the word finally. So he said, I try to use it 6 or 7 times in every speech. So what is it actually like governing Florida? I'd like to give you a quote. Ralph Waldo Emerson. The voyage of the best ship is a zigzag line of 100 tacks. See the line from a sufficient distance, and it straightens itself to the average tendency. The captain of a sailing ship faces 2 simultaneous and sometimes contradictory challenges. He must constantly cope with the change of the wind. To do this, he must be prepared to tack or change directions when the prevailing wind threatens to blow him backward. At the same time, while adjusting pulleys, pulling ropes, and ducking the boom, he must always stay at the helm, using the rudder to stay focused on his destination. If he is successful, his average tendency will be the shortest distance traveled to reach his goals. Using Emerson's word picture, it's possible to look at the Chiles-MacKay years and see not only our goals, but also the places we had to change course in order to reach our goals. Our entire first year was spent trying to stay off the rocks of fiscal insolvency. The governor gets elected in Florida in November. He takes office in January. The fiscal year begins July the 1st. So a governor in Florida inherits the last 6 months of his predecessor's budget. 3 days after Governor Chiles took office, it was necessary that he preside over a cabinet meeting to cut the annual budget of the last Martinez years by 5%. Now that 5% cut for the whole year meant he had to cut 10% in the last 6 months. He then had to do that 3 more times before we got to July. So there were 4 budget cuts before we even got to our first budget. And we cut $1 billion out of the last Martinez budget. And then we introduced a budget that was $1 billion lower than the last Martinez budget. And then that had to be cut 3 more times before we stabilized. So 9 months in office, the budget, this was a $30 billion budget, had been cut $1.6 billion. That doesn't sound like a lot of money. But while we were cutting $1.6 billion, 250,000 more people had moved into the state of Florida, including 100,000 more school children and 200,000 more Medicaid applications. So we were dealing with 250,000 new people who had cut the budget by more than 10%, the most of any governor in the history of Florida. And we had 1,300 fewer employees, and we were not even at the end of our first calendar year in office. 8 years later, we left the state in the best financial shape in its history. When people look back, this may have been our greatest achievement. It certainly was the most painful. It kept us in a constant state of chaos, and in Emerson's terms, it made us start our journey sailing against a headwind of unprecedented strength. We reduced infant mortality more than any other state in America. We introduced and passed the strongest public finance campaign financing in America. We started civil service reform. We started school accountability. We cut the state welfare rolls in half. We had Hurricane Andrew. Someone was asking, well, what are we going to do about insurance rates when we have another big hurricane? The answer is we're going to have to deal honestly and fairly with that, and we're going to have to do that in a way that doesn't subsidize one part of the state to help people in another part of the state. We had a state oversight board for the city of Miami. I chaired that. Me from Ocala, Florida. I chaired an oversight board that ran the city of Miami for 2 years. The mayor at that time was a person known as Crazy Joe Carollo, Crazy Joe. I'm told I need to be very careful because there are libel laws. We enforced the state water laws for the first and only time in the history of the state of Florida. So what is it like to govern the state of Florida? You've got to be ready to move. You've got to be ready to change when the wind changes, and you've got to understand this is not a single state. It can't be dealt with as a single state, and it's got to be dealt with fairly for all the people, old-timers, newcomers, regardless of what country they have come from. One final word about Lawton Chiles, and I think this is very important. There's a risk that all of the colorful stories about Governor Chiles will lead people to the conclusion that he was not a substantive person, not a substantive leader. Lawton Chiles was one of the great leaders in the history of this state and really in the history of this country. And when we get far enough away that people can look back and see the average tendency, they're going to see that on issues like campaign finance reform and like efforts to balance the federal budget, this was really one of the fine leaders in this country in the last century. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Governor. I am Mike Griffin. I'm the Deputy Editorial Page Editor of the Orlando Sentinel, and I'm very honored to be here today. I have to say, though, that there are much finer representatives of journalism that could have been here to do this today, and some of them are actually sitting in this room right now. It is a craft that fewer and fewer people are doing well, and the scarier part is that even fewer people are paying any attention. So I just wanted to get that out of the way. I am a UCF alum. Dick Batchelor stole all the good UCF jokes, except for, and I kind of remember my freshman and sophomore years. They're kind of a blur, but I definitely remember my junior and senior years. And I knew that at that time UCF did stand for You Can't Finish. And now from what I understand, it stands for, God, what does it stand for? That's it, under construction forever, and I don't doubt that a bit. I am really, when I was called and asked to do this, I was kind of in awe of what I was asked to do, because there were, the thing that the governor talked about, the successes and the challenges, you have to also understand the context and time that this was in. This was in the 90s when Republicans were in ascension in this state, and Democrats were on the decline. And not only did they have to govern one of the largest and fastest growing states in the country, they had to do it at a time of a political war that I think has been maybe never seen in this country when it comes to the battles that were going on in the legislature and on the campaign trail. I mean, the 2000 election underscored how separated the parties are and the philosophies are. When Governor Chiles and Governor MacKay were trying to deal with this, first they were dealing, yes, with a Republican ascendancy and a Democratic-controlled legislature, but the Democrats in that legislature were very worried about losing control, so they were willing to compromise with the Republicans probably far more often than you'd have appreciated. And the Republicans were much better at being a minority party than the Democrats are. The Republicans were very disciplined. They spoke with one voice, and they went after issues in a way that would draw Democrats to their side. And then ultimately, after the team won re-election, the Republicans took over. So the last portion of their administration, they had to deal with a Republican legislature, and actually did so quite effectively, primarily, I think, because of, at the time, Senate President Tony Jennings. And there are some interesting things here, and the governor talked about some of his successes. I think you have to point to some of the, I hate to call them failures, but to be polite, we'll say goals that were slightly unattained. We'll go that way. One of them was tax reform, and Governor Chiles really was interested in reforming Florida's tax structure, and people will tell you to this day that it is the most bizarre tax structure. It's based on a consumption tax. The poor pay a higher percentage than the rich, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, particularly when you exempt hundreds and hundreds of items that are not taxed. It's an economy that does great when things are going great, and it's miserable when things are not going great. When the economy catches a cold across the country, Florida gets pneumonia because people stop spending and it crashes. It didn't happen. They could not get that through the legislature, and the irony of this, I think, is that the leaders of the tax reform effort now are moderate Republicans who, when they were in the legislature, wouldn't come across that fence to work with the governor because they wanted to maintain political control and they were concerned about that. I think that's one of the lessons that I took away from my time in Tallahassee, and frankly why I stopped covering politics after the 2000 election, is that it wasn't about policy. It is about winning, and the policy gets lost in the mix, and the result, I think, is a pretty divided country right now, and I guess that's a topic for another symposium. But that's the point I wanted to get across, is that Governor Chiles and Governor MacKay were effective in working across the aisle, and that is very difficult to do. Governor Bush, for all of his successes, has never had to worry about that. He's pretty much been able, if he can keep his guys on the reservation, he's okay. And so that's a different type of leadership, I think, that ought to be pointed out. One of the other shortcomings, I would guess, was the idea of universal health care. That didn't happen. Again, it was a time when money was tight and the effort, I think, just fell short. What he did get out of that, though, and the governor alluded to it too slightly, is the idea of health care for children. And he mentioned in passing the mortality rate, the infant mortality rate in Florida, but it is really worth noting this, that children do not vote, okay? Many of the parents of the kids that needed this service don't vote because primarily they're poor women. The infant mortality rate between 1990 and 1997 in Florida dropped 36%. That is an amazing accomplishment. It's not one that you'll ever see on a campaign flyer, okay? That is an amazing accomplishment. And Florida, for the first time since they started keeping the records, was below the national average in infant mortality rate. So I think that's one of his major successes. And the other success, I think, of course, is campaign finance reform. It was interesting, though, and we'll talk. I don't want to go on too long because I know you guys have been sitting here for a long time. The campaign finance reform that Governor Chiles championed and actually succeeded in making law does limit the amount of contributions, individual contributions you can make. But just like water finds its lowest level, there's always the way to get around these laws, and it's bundling. And if you noticed on a lot of the Chiles-MacKay campaign, yes, they were all $100 contributions, but many of them seem to come from the same people, which I thought was the same law firms, the same. But I mean, and they get tagged for that. But I have to tell you that it's better that they're bundling $100 contributions than they're bundling $500 contributions or $1,000 contributions or unlimited amounts of contributions. And so the law that they put into motion, I think, raised the debate to a level that hasn't been seen since, except when Senator McCain pushed for it. And again, it's a joke. Today, the campaign finance laws are a joke. There's not a real commitment to doing anything about it. And there was a time when there were people in office who thought it was important and tried to do something about it. And I think, again, that's something that deserves a nod. And just to talk about Chiles for a second, when you're rich, or when you're the president, or when you're governor, you're eccentric, okay? If any of you guys tried to do this stuff, they might take a look at maybe putting you away for a couple of months, if you know what I'm saying. The governor had a unique sense of humor. He was able to laugh at himself, and he was able to laugh at situations. He used to play great practical jokes on reporters. I think there was one reporter during a campaign flight If I'm wrong, I think the reporter might be here. It was a press flight. I think the reporter, Tim, you're the only one on the plane, right? Only reporter on the plane. Well, they're flying, and suddenly Governor Chiles starts acting in a panic and quick, everybody fasten your seatbelts, everybody fasten your seatbelts. And then Tim is like, from what I understand, flipping out on the plane because he thought the plane was going to crash. Well, that was Lawton Chiles. I mean, another reporter was in a car with him, and when you're riding with the governor, it can be a bit cool because everybody gets out of your way, which is kind of neat. But they put this bubble on top of the flashing light, and it's on top of the car, and you hear this click, 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 and the reporter asked, well, what's that sound? And the governor goes, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't hear anything. So he went there and they click, click. He goes, you don't hear that sound? He goes, no, I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't know. So they stopped and they got out and they did their thing, got back in the car, and they're driving, and the governor goes, well, I do hear that. What could that be? And the FDLE agent was like, well, I don't know. I mean, maybe we got to stop. So he stopped the car. The reporter just bails out of the car because he thought it was like a bomb or something. Chiles just laughed. I mean, that was the kind of sense of humor he had. The last story I'll tell about Chiles before I finish up is in Governor McKay's '98 campaign. I'm going to tell the plane story. I have to tell the story. There was a reporter. The newspapers, believe it or not, I know this is kind of hard to believe, but reporters are fairly competitive. We have been known to unplug others' laptops and that kind of thing, and give them a hard time. Brian Crowley's here. He knows that story well too. But Governor McKay was running against Jeb Bush, and we were on a plane coming from Orlando to Palm Beach County. And Governor McKay went ahead with the press corps that was traveling with the governor and with Lieutenant Governor McKay, and we were on the plane with Governor Chiles. And we were taking off from Orlando Executive Airport, and one of our colleagues, who no one in the press corps liked, indeed everybody in the press corps hated, happened to be on our flight. And it was the St. Pete Times, the Orlando Sentinel, the Palm Beach Post, and a large newspaper to the south that I won't mention because it's in Miami and we don't really want to talk about the Herald right now. But I won't mention the other newspaper. The plane starts to take off, and the way this works is that campaigns borrow planes from rich people. That's how it works in campaigns. And this was Ben Hill Griffin Jr.'s plane, and we were starting to take off, and suddenly on the takeoff, they just slam on the brakes. The plane stops. And everybody's stuff's flying everywhere, bottles of water, everything. And the pilots looked at each other and they whispered to each other and they said, Governor, I am so sorry. One of our beepers went off and we thought it was a warning light, but everything's okay. We're going to go ahead and take off. So they turned around and came back. The guy was lying. There was a warning that went off. And they came back and started to go off again. And you know that feeling when you're taking off in an airplane, you kind of feel the wheels are just starting to come off the ground. Well, that alarm went off, and that guy slammed on the brakes, and the plane's doing this. It's skidding on the runway, and Lake Barton is getting closer and closer and closer. And I'm sitting there thinking, man, what could possibly happen now? And the plane stops, stuff's flying everywhere. There's this moment of silence, and Chiles goes, wow, that lake was getting close, wasn't it? To make a long story short, they had to send a plane for the governor. He left. And we we didn't draw straws. We let the obnoxious reporter go because nobody wanted to fly with him anymore. We were going to miss the event. So we were sitting there at the beauty of that at night, though, is this is an aside. We got to go have dinner with Chiles. And it was a wonderful evening because we just got to talk to him as people. We didn't interview him. We just talked to him, and it was really neat. But anyway, we get to Palm Beach late. The event's over. The campaign was not going real well, to put it mildly. So the candidate is sitting there thinking, okay, I've got the Palm Beach Post and the Orlando Sentinel sitting at the hotel bar for like a half an hour, really ticked off that they missed that flight. What am I going to do? So he walks in and he's very apologetic. I'm so sorry. I said, Governor, it's okay. Sharice Date, there were other reporters. It's okay. It's fine. No big deal. And he goes, well, wow, what was it like? And I said, well, I can tell you the last thing going through my head was before I die, I just want to reach out and slap Tyler Bridges right in the face. That was the last thing, and that was kind of a kick that we got out of it. The last thing I want to finish on, though, is the issue on the children. Chiles, as the governor, Chiles had he was not as slow as his speech, and he was much sharper than the stories that he told. He was a tough politician. When they snuck the tobacco settlement into the budget, it was a late night move in the Senate. They snuck it in, and it led to the largest tobacco settlement on record at the time. The governor had to withstand a veto. They tried to override the bill the next year. The governor vetoed it. The next year, the legislature was going to try to override the veto. And the politics of that situation was brass knuckle politics. They were really leaning on people. They were tough. The governor was a tough politician. He had to be in that environment, and I think a lot of people miss that. They think of him as this gentle old guy, and in many respects he was, but he was also a very tough politician. The last thing I want to say, though, is right before he died, he came to Orlando. He was doing like a victory tour, and I got to talk to him and interview him for the last time, and I actually pulled the story that I wrote the day he died. And this is from the last interview I ever did with him. We were talking a little bit about what he thought his greatest accomplishment was, and he thought it was what he had done for Florida's children. And the last thing I remember him saying to me, the last thing I wrote down was, if a child is born poor, they are already behind the game. If that child is born poor and sick, then all of us are behind the game. And I learned that a long time ago. So I think that kind of sums up Chiles more than anything else. I really appreciate your time. I hope I didn't go on too long. I hope there are questions for Governor MacKay, because he is really one of the finest public servants Florida's ever produced, and I can say that very objectively. So, thank you.
One of the questions we receive is from Barry University, and they want to know from Governor MacKay, what is the most important job of being Lieutenant Governor?
The way it was done by Governor Chiles was different than it has been done in other administrations. Florida doesn't really spell out what the Lieutenant Governor does. There's no provision in law, and so it really depends on what jobs the governor delegates. In my case, Governor Chiles delegated to me managing the growth management process in the state of Florida, managing the water management districts in the state of Florida, the State Oversight Board in the city of Miami. I spent 6 months in Miami after Hurricane Andrew, when our computer system broke down and gave out double food stamps for 90 days, I went to the Department of HRS and stayed there for 6 months. So I would describe it, in my case, as a troubleshooter's role. It was something I enjoyed very much. It was really, in my case, a partnership with the governor. I'm not sure Florida wouldn't be well off to have some statutory guidelines as to what a lieutenant governor should do, but that's the best answer I can give. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Mr. MacKay, how do you feel regarding legislation changes on term limit?
I'm sorry, I didn't say
Term limits.
Term limits.
Term limits.
term limits. I supported term limits very strongly when the issue was up for passage. I think now it was a mistake. I believe that term limits in a state like Florida, as complex as it is, basically assure that about the time somebody really starts understanding as a legislator how the state works, they have to move on. Now, everybody says, well, that's a good idea. Well, what happens when power is changed in that way? I think there's a shift of power from the elected official to the unelected bureaucrat. He doesn't have term limits. And I think that's something that was not anticipated at the time we supported the change. And I think if we had it to do over, I would be one of the opponents. I personally don't think that's going to happen, But I would mark that down as one of the real mistakes we made.
I share many values of the Democratic Party, and given the opportunity, what advice have you or would you give Democratic Party leaders to strengthen our presence in the state in Washington, D.C.?
I think the secret to a viable democracy is competition. I don't think either party has got a monopoly on the truth. And I think the competitive process keeps both parties sharp. Right now, the Democratic Party's on the short end of that in the state of Florida. What's happening is, it's a painful experience, but what's happening is we're cleaning our house, we're going to be more competitive, and I can tell you if you get past the nuts and bolts of turning our people out to vote, where we haven't done as well as the Republicans, if you start looking at what we stand for, and our ideas of the future, I think you're going to see that the people of Florida essentially are going to come back to the Democratic Party. So my advice would be, don't give up hope, work harder, and make sure you focus on the long-term picture of what do we stand for. And frankly, I stand for a government where everybody's got a fair shake. I stand for a government that is not oriented towards the rich. I stand for a government that's going to help poor people, help with health care, and not going to basically say the market will take care of things.
I was just wondering, what's the most important thing you've learned from Chiles?
Well, I think it's the ability to use humor and humility. It's the ability to have ordinary people understand your vision of what's got to happen in the state of Florida, coupled with the courage to do the right thing. I mean, Lawton doesn't get credit for all the risky things that he did, and I think in part his genius was to couple this long-term vision with this folksy way of selling his ideas.
And also, I'm interested in a political career when I grow up. What do you recommend I expose myself to? What kind of education?
I think political science is very important. I also think economics is very important. One of the things that bothers me, and there are a number of members of the press here, is that in the College of Journalism and at times in political science, I don't see anybody dealing with these long-term economic concepts. And I can tell you, if the press doesn't understand them and the political scientists don't understand them, it's very difficult to sell these kind of abstruse ideas. For instance, what a mistake I'm making. If Florida would adopt a marginal cost system and would charge impact fees based on the marginal cost of putting homes in environmentally sensitive systems, this state would work much differently. Our failure to do that, which is uniform cost accounting, means we're putting homes in the wrong place. It's creating huge problems, and all of us are paying for the difference. Now, marginal cost accounting is something that unfortunately is very difficult to explain in the press. I could go on with several other economic concepts. If I were you, I would couple studying political science with economics.
What do you recall being your biggest obstacle as Lieutenant Governor?
Well, it was a lack of a clearly defined role. If I didn't have the governor solidly behind me, and there is no statute saying this is the role, I would have found myself in many instances with people saying, what authority have you got to try to tell us to do things? Fortunately, I worked with a man who supported very strongly the efforts I made.
Okay, thank you.
Governor, please allow me to read one more question coming to you via satellite before we'll go to these two young men, and then we'll have to wrap it up, I believe. This question is also from Barry University, and the question is, Governor MacKay, what are you doing now in private life, and would you ever consider running for governor again?
Thank you to my friends from South Florida. I'm not interested in any further career in elected office. I'm working currently as a volunteer in the juvenile court system, I'm trying to help institute a system of mediation in dependency cases. These are cases where the child is taken from the home not because the child did something wrong, but because the family fell apart. These cases are very difficult to handle in court. Part of the reason we're having so much trouble in our foster home system is the cumbersome nature of court proceedings trying to deal with essentially family problems. Mediation, I think, is a solution to that. That's what I'm doing, and I'm finding it very gratifying. Thank you.
We wanted to ask, what was your reason for wanting to run for a public office?
Well, that's a very complicated question, and each of us would have a different answer. Let me just say, I saw things that I didn't like. I saw, when I came out of law school, I had been in the military, and I had seen a lot of the world that I had never seen before that. And I came back and I realized we still had segregated schools, we had a segregated university, we had a political system that reflected the old South. It didn't really reflect what was going on in Orlando and Miami and Fort Lauderdale and these huge growth areas. And I said, wait a minute, I don't want to be for the rest of my career part of a state that's kind of a laughing stock of the rest of America. I'm going to do something about it. So that's how I got in it. And I didn't really intend to make a career of it, but it's a fascinating career. I hope all of you young people who are looking at this will consider it. I hope you won't let today's cynicism drive you away from it. It's fascinating, it's interesting, and you'll end up realizing yourself that you did have something to do with your life that made a difference. Thank you.
Governor, we have one final question they have asked me to relay to you. This is from the folks watching via satellite from Central Florida Community College. This will be our final question for Governor MacKay. Governor MacKay, what policy options would you suggest now to improve health care?
I strongly support managed care. I believe it can be made to work in a way that is much fairer and more impartial. I think the idea that Lawton went forward with is a great idea, and that is you can have a group insurance concept using children as the indicator of the group. You can insure the families that have children in schools, and I believe if the public paid part of the cost of that, we would get more bang for our buck. We'd get more improvement in public health in Florida than in any other way. Now, what you do beyond that, you've got to understand, regardless of what people say in politics, this is going to be determined largely by the Congress and the President, and I'm not sure that I would agree with anything that's coming out of Washington right now. Thank you so much.